everyone, and welcome back. I have long wanted to do a video about rainbow fashions of history, and what better time since it is the beginning of June. Now, I admit I started this video off thinking that it was going to be a really lovely jaunt through just a lot of pictures of textiles and garments, which it will be, but I also had a bit of an existential crisis in the middle of it because I realized that I don't actually have a clear idea of how to define rainbow. Not as in a rainbow, but as in a rainbow of colors. When I look at a fabric or look at a garment, what makes it go from being colorful to rainbow? And it turns out the definition of that is even more complicated than I realized and has changed through history and is at least partially dependent on how we color fabric as to how we define rainbow. So we get to learn some really fun things today. Obviously, the idea of what a rainbow is very clear theoretically, but in reality, that even gets a bit muddled. So rainbows as a phenomenon, of course, existed before humankind did, and can be found in mythology and writings of cultures around the world. The interesting part comes in when we get to the modern idea of a rainbow, which for most of us comes from Isaac Newton. So in the 17th century, he spent a lot of time studying rainbows, as many people had before him, and he came up with the ROYGBIV system, or the red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, which is what I was taught when I was younger is the definition of a rainbow. Well, it turns out he originally came up with a system that did not include 7 colors, but only had 5: red, yellow, green, blue, and violet. So he added 2 more at a later point, in part because he just liked using the number 7. He related it back to the classical idea of using 7 for days of the week, for musical notes, for how many planets at that time they knew to be in the solar system. So 7 was kind of this happy little magical number, and so that's what he decided to go with. Now today, if you look up the more modern version of this, it's actually red, orange, yellow, green, cyan, blue, violet. So we have a better understanding of it now, and things kind of got shifted around a little bit, I guess. But if anything, that just explains to us that we don't have a really clear-cut definition. We don't have to have all 7 colors for it to feel like a rainbow. In fact, historically, we can find lots of examples that only use 3, and we can still clearly go, ah, yes, rainbow. So is it using 3 or more colors? Because once you take it out of the context of the arc, 3 colors doesn't really feel like a rainbow. So there's more to this than all of that. Let's start back in more the 17th, 18th century. Some of the earlier versions that I started to find that I kind of feel like fit within the definition of rainbow are different types of embroidery and what we call fly fringe, that really fluffy little stuff on 18th century gowns. So there's a lot of application of color in a decorative manner onto other things. One of my favorite examples that I came across is this man's nightcap from the 17th century. The embroidery on it is clearly meant to be a rainbow. It's not necessarily in the colors we would expect, though it has 4 clearly different colors, and given the context of the clouds and everything else, very much fits within that rainbow style. In terms of other types of embroidery from around the same time, there are plenty of what we call flame-stitched shoes, and other types of goods as well, but these are some of my favorites, that are definitely in a rainbow of colors. They have all of the colors included, even though they aren't set up in the order that would denote a rainbow to us. All of the colors are here in these embroidered shoes. There's also this late 18th century gown from Colonial Williamsburg that is in a black silk, which is very unusual for the time, and just absolutely trimmed and embroidered with all of this beautiful rainbow of colors. It too is not in the correct order to denote it as a rainbow, nor does it have a rainbow motif. However, it definitely feels like a rainbow. There's all of the colors present, a whole range of things shifting back and forth. Now, there are plenty of examples of rainbow colors being set in that order throughout the 17th and 18th centuries as well. It's just you generally find them to be a little bit more subtle. Color is a really strong fashion choice in the 18th century, and to have all of the colors at once is a really bold decision. So a lot of times what you will find is that they are woven into the flowers in brocades. So the main fabric will be 1 or 2 colors, but the gradient of the flowers will be in a rainbow. So you have to look a little bit more closely at all of these different samples and originals in order to see the rainbow that is buried within. Of course, there are also times where they just go all out with color. It's usually in stripes and plaids where they will start to have 3 or more colors, and it starts to feel like a rainbow even if it doesn't necessarily go in the correct order. Again, especially when it comes to those plaids, checks as they would have called most of these in the era, where the overlapping colors and when it comes to the weaving process of the warp and the weft means that as blue goes over yellow it becomes green, etc. So we end up with a rainbow of colors even if that wasn't the original intention with these. There's just tons of really beautiful, vibrant examples though. Certainly nothing like the world of dull brown tones that Hollywood has led us to believe the past look like. This stuff is bright. But all of this is the point where I started to really wonder, how do we define rainbow? Because many of the things that I came across had tons of colors in them, but they just didn't feel rainbow. Well, it turns out in the 19th century, we started to get some really specific definitions of what that meant when we start coming up with new ways of printing and dyeing fabric. Lots of new technology, lots of new machines. Now, this is also the point that we start coming up with new terminology for this, including terms like ombre, which we know, generally referring to sort of gently fading between 2 or more colors. We also have the term fondue, which was popularly used during this time, which has to do with the melting of the colors together, and they would start terming all of this under the same umbrella of rainbow shading. So we start seeing a lot about rainbow printed, rainbow shading, rainbow colors, all those different types of terminologies as of the 1820s. It wasn't that they couldn't do rainbow things prior to this point, it was just the fact that it's really clunky and really complicated. In the 18th century, large quantities of fabric with lots of colors were very often done by hand painting. It's a very lengthy and time-consuming and expensive process. The 19th century was attempting to automate all of that. You could, of course, do block printing. That's definitely something we see in the time period, but again, when you're doing extensive large amounts of fabric, painting the block, setting it down, picking it up, starting over again, every single time gets kind of exhausting. So they really wanted to find new ways of very quickly applying multiple colors and blending them together. And this is where the ribbon roller comes in. Now, in some documents, I found that this was attributed to being invented by Mercer, who's the same person who came up with mercerized cotton. But in some of the other documents, he's just really well known for using it, made it kind of popular. Either way, what happens is we have an engraved cylinder that runs through a bed of the color and picks it up in small amounts and deposits that onto the fabric, sort of gradually building up a color. So this might be visible in some situations where it's almost like stippling or tiny hashes, and gradually as those hash marks build up, it blends that color out. So there are some times where you can actually visibly see this on the fabric. It seems to generally be more intentional in these cases, but this is the sort of thing that they're doing, just sometimes on a smaller scale or blending it out a little bit better. And the initial idea was simply, well, what if we have basically a bunch of paintbrushes on these really large rollers that are printing onto the fabric? We then have something in between them, which is sort of smoothing it out afterwards with the paintbrush, and then as it's rolling this onto the fabric, it will give kind of a smooth effect. And so this allowed them to gradiate things and create that ombre effect, as we would call it today, really quickly. And they very often refer to this, regardless of the number of colors, as rainbow shading. So we start seeing references as of the 1820s to rainbow shaded fabrics, rainbow shaded gowns, and it starts picking up in popularity. And as technology improves, the mill engraving machine, for example, makes engraving all of those cylinders a lot faster and easier. They start to become more and more popular. But with the increase in popularity means that they're churning it out a lot faster, and that a lot of companies started producing really low quality versions of this. So it apparently started to fall out of popularity, according to Wearable Prints by Susan Green. By the 1850s, we stopped seeing so many rainbow prints, and in fact, the 1851 Great Exhibition, which you may know is one of my favorite topics, apparently none of the swatches of textiles that they chose to show off the latest and greatest had that sort of rainbow shading in there. So it was going out of style, kind of. What didn't go out of style from what I could find, however, was still the idea of that ombre shading between a color to white. So there's still plenty of references and plenty of surviving examples of garments throughout the 1850s and 1860s talking about this. For example, an 1852 article talked about how Queen Victoria wore a white watered rainbow silk gown, which seemed a bit contradictory, but I'm assuming they're talking about rainbow printing on top of a watered silk, and that perhaps it was shaded from one color to another. I don't know exactly what color because it just simply says white, but assumably the rainbow shading is what they're talking about more so than a rainbow of colors. This other article talks about various rainbow silk gowns with different types of shading, and that going up the tiers of these ruffled skirts in the 1850s would gradually turn from one color to another. So again, in all of these, they mention two colors that it's fading in between. It's just referring to those as rainbow instead of something like ombre. And of course, you'll still see plenty of multiple colors being used in plaids and stripes where things overlap and start to turn into multiple colors. So we're still seeing what could very much be considered rainbow in the era, but the terminology is much broader than our modern sense, and the idea of the multicolored rainbow doesn't seem to be as popular at that time. That starts to shift as more and more dye technology comes out and more colors are being made, and by the time we reach the 1880s, we start to go a little crazy when it comes to vibrant tones and how many things can we fit onto one outfit that don't really go together. And this is the point where rainbow comes back with a vengeance, both in the shaded format as well as just actual rainbows. This petticoat is one of my favorite examples because you never would have seen this. It would have been underneath the skirt, except maybe little flashes here and there if it was being worn under an evening gown and someone was dancing. There's also this amazing article from 1893 that actually describes in detail how you can make your own rainbow silk. It has you hand paint all of the different tones onto the silk, all the different colors. It does specify that because of the way that you're doing things, it's not going to necessarily be waterproof, rainproof, that it is, as it puts it, perishable, but it also says you wouldn't go out in your silks in the rain anyway, so what difference does it make? But we start seeing rainbow in so many different formats, particularly ribbons. Tons of these rainbow shaded ribbons in so many different colors. There are all these amazing swatch books online. I've linked my Pinterest board for this below so you can go back through all of these different images and find the links because there's just so many swatch books, more than I could possibly list here. But they start throwing rainbow into everything. There's even this amazing example of a tweed from the 1890s which has rainbow threads in it. So it's a lot more subtle, but it's still very much there. They also really love to keep up with that rainbow shading. So there are great examples of the times where that's actually dyed, like this example in velvet going from yellow through green to blue. There's also this great example that I got to see last year at the Missouri Historical Society, which has the most beautiful gradients of greens, but those are woven in to be like that. This fabric was definitely made specifically for this type of gown. So there are plenty of examples of both rainbow colors and rainbow shading. I also don't want to move too far forward without taking a look at the fancy dress options for rainbows, because while they aren't in the standard fashion, they are very prevalent from the 1860s onward. We have all of these different gowns, including one designed by Worth, that are meant to represent rainbows or something very similar for fancy dress parties. Essentially, I am going to dress up as a rainbow. And there are so many different variations on this one theme. It seems to be a pretty popular costume idea. So if you're looking for something for next Halloween, you can think outside of the typical box a little bit and dress up as a rainbow. I particularly love this one because I honestly don't know if she has rainbow stockings or that rainbow portion is part of her boots, but I'm happy with it either way. There's also what I feel is kind of like a weird hippie Princess Leia vibe going on. This one from 1907, I definitely would wear that skirt. I'm less sure about this one with the rainbow snake option. At this point, we've actually just moved into ballet and dress costumes, so it's less for fancy dress and more for stage costume. By the time we reach the 1920s, this 1928 example, we're sort of moving into what's much more the familiar gradient. They're no longer relying on red, blue, yellow in a lot of cases. We now have all of the colors we're really used to seeing in these rainbow gradients, because this is really an era where there's an absolute explosion of color. Granted, we've had plenty of colorful dyes for decades at that point, but this is the era where things become color fast, meaning that they're washable. You can get clothing, throw it in the wash, and the fabric won't bleed, the dye won't come out. So this is another era where color really takes off because it's just an easier option for everything. And they start putting rainbow on as much stuff as they can, really picking up in the 19-teens, and by the 1920s it is well established. One of the earlier versions that I found was this Liberty coat between 1905 1905 and 1910. It is ikat and it's painted on in that way, which would make sense for that designer. There's also this absolutely gorgeous portrait where her belt is very clearly rainbow, and there are plenty of other examples of similar ribbons that are in sample books. They also really love rainbow velvet. We have rainbow velvet on the lining of the coat, and it's also got some metallic work done on top of it. It's just so much going on, but it's the lining, which is absolutely crazy to me how fun that would have been to just be able to flash that around suddenly. They also started doing rainbow lame, which is just so much happening there. There's this example from Paul Poiret in 1925. They also got really into tie-dye in the 1920s, which I feel is a whole different video that I will do at some point when I get the chance to actually do some tie-dye. And so they picked up all these bright and vibrant colors mixed together in that format as well. They got really obsessed with all sorts of strange new techniques for dyeing fabrics during this time, but it seems to sort of fade back for just a little bit. From the 1930s through the 1950s and into the 60s to begin with, they have a lot of very colorful rainbow vibes with stripes. I didn't find as much in terms of the more ombre styles and the mixing of colors that seems to really have taken place in the 20s. They sort of quiet down just a little bit and keep it a bit more organized. Still plenty of great examples of what I feel qualify as rainbow, even if they aren't in the rainbow order. One of the few exceptions that I sort of came across for this was a Madame Grey jacket from the 1950s, where you see the subtle rainbow through that weaving technique, kind of like the 18th century fabrics we saw earlier, but then on the lining and where the cuff is folded back, it's a really vibrant rainbow ombre style. But of course, as we reach the 1960s, that's when it just comes back with an absolute vengeance. So this is also the point, interestingly enough, in the late 1960s, early 70s, where the 1920s is back in style again. So there are a lot of elements from that time period that get picked back up and reused and remade, and things like tie-dye and rainbow seem to be two of those things. Really bright and vibrant colors start showing up everywhere, and these are truly rainbow. Any which way they can come up with adding rainbow to sheer fabrics, solid fabrics, make it stripes, make it ombre, just any which way. I found more rainbow fashion in the 1970s than I could possibly begin to show in this one video. There's even menswear that starts to get absolutely crazy in colors and stripes, so men aren't left out of this either. There's just a lot more options for vibrant women's wear, it seems. One of my favorite examples, however, from the 1970s was this gown that was worn by Elizabeth Taylor in 1975 for one of her weddings. But there are so many amazing examples, and rainbows certainly didn't go away. Through the 80s, through the 90s, rainbows were absolutely everywhere. We've all heard of Lisa Frank. So rainbow was a really big thing for a really long time, and it only sort of faded out of popular use once we reached the end of the 90s. In 1978, Gilbert Baker ended up designing the pride flag that, in different variations, has come to be used so prolifically. It wasn't until the 90s that it really started to gain traction as public knowledge, however, until we reached the point where we are in the 21st century, where it is so heavily associated with it. But obviously, when we hit the month of June, tons of different companies put out all of these different garments in rainbow color as part of Pride Month celebrations. But obviously, throughout history, rainbow has been such a common part of our fashion ever since we could really start dyeing things in really vibrant colors, and every single time we came up with yet another technology to make it easier to dye things in a more complex and colorful way, we kept adding to it. So rainbows can be found throughout Western fashion, as well as, of course, throughout fashion around the world, and that goes well beyond my scope. I do want to show you one of my personal favorites that I own, which is this lovely shibori silk from Japan that has been rainbow dyed. And yes, it does sort of resemble tie-dye. It's in that same family of techniques. Again, at some point I will do a whole video on tie-dye. I just actually want to physically do some stuff with that as well. But for today, that was all of the really amazing fabrics and garments that I could find that seem to qualify as rainbow, which, as I discovered, is not a really easy thing to define. But I hope you have enjoyed this very colorful look at the history of fashion, and happy Pride Month!